The bullet had passed clean through Tobias Brenner's shoulder, but the infection that followed it was the thing that nearly killed him. He had been dragged into the town of Cowboy Creek, New Mexico territory, in the back of a freight wagon on a Thursday afternoon in late April of 1883, his shirt soaked through with blood that had long since turned the color of rust, his face the pale gray-white of a man who had already half surrendered to the idea of dying. The two men who brought him in were ranch hands from the Lazy K, a cattle operation some 20 miles north of town, and they dropped him on the front steps of the only medical establishment in a 100-mile radius with the casual efficiency of men who had done such things before. That establishment was a single-room clinic built from rough-hewn timber and whitewashed adobe, with a painted sign above the door that read simply, A. Collins, Medical Care. The A stood for Ada. Ada Collins heard the commotion from inside, where she had been grinding willow bark into powder and measuring it with a brass scale that had belonged to her father. She came to the door wiping her hands on her apron, took one look at the man slumped against her steps, and said, with the flat authority of someone who had seen worse on better days, "Bring him inside and put him on the table." She was 26 years old, with dark brown hair pinned up severely at the back of her head and gray eyes that missed very little. She had come to Cowboy Creek 3 years ago, following the death of her father, Dr. Samuel Collins, who had himself established the clinic before a rattlesnake bite took him faster than he would have liked. Ada had trained alongside her father since she was old enough to hold a bandage, and while no territorial board would grant her the title of physician on account of her being a woman, she was the only medical practitioner within 100 miles in any direction. The people of Cowboy Creek had long ago stopped worrying about whether her credentials were properly papered and started simply calling her the nurse, though what she did went considerably beyond nursing. She set bones. She delivered babies. She amputated fingers and toes, and once a leg below the knee, and that man had lived and now ran the feed store on the corner of Main and Sycamore and always tipped his hat to her when she passed. The ranch hands hauled Tobias Brenner inside and laid him on the long wooden examination table, which Ada kept covered with a sheet of clean muslin she boiled once a week. He groaned when they shifted him, and Ada took that as a good sign. The dead did not groan. She peeled back his shirt, or what remained of it, and studied the wound with calm, professional eyes. The entry and exit were both visible, which meant the bullet had done its damage and departed, leaving behind a ragged tunnel of torn muscle through the meat of his left shoulder. That was almost fortunate. What was not fortunate was the angry red swelling that had spread from the wound in every direction, hot to the touch, and the faint but unmistakable scent of suppuration that told her infection had already taken hold. "How long has he been like this?" she asked the ranch hands. "Found him day before yesterday," the taller one said, a man named Garrett who Ada knew slightly. "Out near the Ortiz Wash. Horse was gone. No idea who shot him. He was conscious enough to say his name and not much else. Was he running a fever when you found him?" "Bad one. Talking out of his head something terrible." Ada nodded, already moving to her cabinet to gather what she needed. "Go find Reverend Marsh and tell him I may need help tonight. Tell him it is not for last rites, it is for holding a patient still while I work. There is a difference." The ranch hands left, and Ada turned her full attention to Tobias Brenner. He was, she noted in the clinical and wholly detached way she had trained herself to observe patients, a well-built man. Broad through the chest and shoulders, with the kind of lean, hard muscle that came not from vanity but from years of physical labor. His hands, even slack at his sides, were the hands of a working man, calloused and scarred in the small particular ways that said roping and riding and fence mending. His face was tanned to the color of old saddle leather, with a jaw that could have been cut from stone, and several days' worth of dark stubble that had moved past stubble and begun to consider itself a beard. His hair was dark brown and needed cutting. He was probably, she guessed, somewhere around 30 years old. She began cleaning the wound, and he hissed through his teeth and half opened his eyes. They were blue, remarkably, unexpectedly blue, the color of the sky over the mesa just after the sun cleared the horizon. Ada noted this the same way she noted everything else, filed it, and got on with her work. "You are in a medical clinic," she told him, because patients often needed orientation when they swam up from fever and pain. "My name is Ada Collins. You are in Callow Creek, New Mexico territory. You are going to be all right if you cooperate with me. Do you understand?" He stared at her for a moment with those startling blue eyes, unfocused and glassy with fever. Then very slowly he said, "Yes, ma'am," and his voice was low and rough and cracked from dehydration, but there was something in it, some thread of steadiness, that suggested the man underneath the fever was not the kind of man who gave up easily. "Good," she said. "This next part is going to hurt." She did not apologize for it, and she did not soften it, and she saw something in his expression that might have been relief at that. He braced himself against the table and did not cry out, though when she probed the wound to assess the depth of the infection, his whole body went rigid and his knuckles went white where his good hand gripped the edge of the table, and a sound escaped him that was not quite human. She worked quickly, debridement and irrigation, a poultice of comfrey and golden seal root packed into the wound, a careful binding with clean linen. When she was done, she prepared a willow bark decoction and added a measure of laudanum from her dwindling supply, because the pain would not let him rest otherwise, and rest was what he needed most. "Drink this," she said, lifting his head. He drank without argument, which she appreciated. She sat with him through the night, because that was what the situation required. Reverend Marsh came and went, a small and quietly capable man of about 50 who had developed, through long association with Ada's clinic, the ability to assist in medical procedures without fainting or making unhelpful theological commentary. He helped her change the poultice at midnight and again at 3 in the morning, and by the time the sky outside the window began to go from black to dark blue, the patient's fever had broken into a drenching sweat, and his breathing had steadied considerably. "He may actually make it," Marsh said, with the tone of a man who was pleasantly surprised. "He will make it," Ada said, with the tone of a woman who had decided the matter. She slept for 4 hours in the chair beside his bed because it was the nearest horizontal surface available, and she trusted herself to wake if anything changed, which she did exactly. When she woke, Tobias Brenner was watching her. Not with the glassy fever stare of the night before, but with a clear, alert attention that was somehow, absurdly, more disconcerting. Ada straightened in her chair and pulled herself together with the professional composure she kept always at hand, like a well-stocked bag. "Good morning," she said. "You are considerably less likely to die than you were 12 hours ago." "That is reassuring," he said. His voice was still rough but steadier, and there was something dry and deliberate in his tone that suggested he was a man who used humor as a way of navigating difficulty. "I want to thank you, Miss Collins." "Mrs. Collins is also incorrect," she said, which was not what he had said but was relevant context. "It is Ada Collins, or you may call me Ada." "Most patients do, eventually." He considered this. "Tobias Brenner," he said. "Most people call me Toby. I have never liked it much." "Tobias it is then," she said. "Are you hungry?" He said he was, which was another good sign. She made him broth from the pot she kept on the small stove in the corner, the broth she prepared every Sunday from whatever bones and vegetables were available, because she had found over years of practice that getting nourishment into a recovering patient was half the battle, and broth was something most people could manage when solid food was still impossible. She brought it to him in a clay bowl and watched him drink it with the particular single-minded concentration of a man whose body was demanding everything it had been denied. "The men who brought you in said they found you near the Ortiz Wash," she said, when the bowl was empty. "They did not know who shot you or why." "No," he agreed. She waited because she had learned that patience was often more productive than direct questioning. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at the window where the morning light was coming in pale and clean. "I was riding through," he said finally, "heading south. There were 3 men on the trail. I did not know them. They asked me to hand over my horse and my guns and whatever money I was carrying. I declined." "You declined," Ada said. 3 against 1. "I have never claimed to be a sensible man," Tobias said, and there was that dry quality again, the humor that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "I managed 2 of them before the 3rd one caught me. Woke up later with no horse, no guns, no money, and a hole in my shoulder. The horse carried me a few more miles before he gave out. Then I was on foot. In the desert." "In the desert," he confirmed. Ada absorbed this. "You are fortunate the ranch hands found you when they did. Another day in that heat with that infection, and there would have been nothing for me to do for you but call Reverend Marsh for the other reason." Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile but was more than his previous expression. "Then I am grateful to them," he said. "And to you, Ada." It was the first time he had used her name, and it landed differently than she had expected, clear and direct, and without any of the awkward formality that men usually attach to her name when they were unsure of how to address a woman of her professional status. She found, to her mild irritation, that she had no immediate response, and so she simply took his empty bowl and went to refill it. He slept again after the 2nd bowl, and she used the time to see the 2 other patients she was currently managing. Old Hector Vega from the cantina, who had a suppurating carbuncle on his neck that required daily attention, and young Patsy Dunmore, who was in the early stages of a pregnancy that had started promisingly enough, but was beginning to show signs of complication. Ada made her rounds with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had designed her own schedule and organized her own world, because there was no one else to do it, and came back to find Tobias awake again and attempting, with visible determination, to sit up. "Do not," she said from the doorway. He stopped. "I need to use the facilities," he said, with the particular dignified discomfort of a proud man in a situation he found undignified. Ada took this in stride. She had been dealing with the logistics of human bodies and their requirements for 3 years without flinching. She provided what he needed, helped him manage the situation with brisk practicality, and when he was settled again, she found him looking at her with an expression she could not quite name. "You are remarkably unflappable," he said. "I cannot afford to be flappable," she said. "I am the only medical care within 100 miles. If I flap, people die." He was quiet for a moment, considering this. "Then that is a considerable weight to carry." "It is the weight I chose," she said simply. But something in the way he said it made her aware that he understood, in a way that many people did not, that choosing a weight and finding it easy were very different things. Most people in Callow Creek respected what she did and were glad she was there, and thought very little about what it cost her. This man, who had known her less than 24 hours, had seen it in one sentence. She did not examine that too closely. She had patience to manage. The next 3 days followed a pattern. Ada tended Tobias's wound morning and evening, changing the poultice, checking for signs of spreading infection, monitoring his fever, which continued to decline. She brought him broth and then, as his appetite strengthened, solid food, bread and dried beans, and once, when Abuela Reyes from 2 streets over sent over a pot of chili stew as payment for the assistance Ada had rendered her youngest son's broken collarbone the previous winter. A bowl of that stew that Tobias ate with such unabashed gratitude that Ada felt something warm move through her chest, which she also did not examine. He was, she discovered gradually and entirely against her professional intentions, a very engaging man to talk to. Not in the loud or performative way of men who wanted to impress. Rather, he was the kind of man who listened with his full attention and spoke thoughtfully when he had something worth saying. He asked her questions about her work, and they were not the questions men usually asked, which tended toward skepticism about whether a woman could really manage such things. They were genuine questions about medicine and the challenges of practicing it in a frontier territory with limited supplies and no institutional support. He asked about her father, and she found herself telling him things she had not told anyone. About the afternoon her father was bitten, about the long night she had spent trying every remedy she knew, about the particular grief of losing a person to the very circumstances you had both spent years trying to fight. He listened to all of this. He did not offer platitudes. He said, when she finished, "He sounds like he was a man worth knowing." And she had to look away for a moment because the simplicity of it hit her somewhere she was not defended against. She asked about him because equal exchange seemed fair, and he told her. Raised on a cattle ranch in Texas, the second of 4 brothers, had been working as a cattle drover and occasional ranch hand since he was 17. He had been, for the past 2 years, drifting somewhat, working where work was available, sleeping under the stars when it was warm enough. He described this not with the romanticism some men attached to the wandering life, but with the matter-of-fact accuracy of someone who was honest enough to call a thing what it was. He had been running from something, or towards something, or simply moving because stillness had started to feel like suffocation after an event he alluded to but did not detail, and Ada did not press, because she understood that some wounds were not ready for light. By the 5th day, his color had returned. By the 7th, he was sitting up without assistance, and the infection had receded to almost nothing, leaving only the normal healing soreness that would take weeks to fully resolve. By the 10th day, he should have been ready to leave. He did not leave. He did not exactly announce that he was staying. He simply continued to be there. He began, on the 11th day, to do small things. He swept the front step of the clinic, which she had not asked him to do, using the broom she kept propped by the door. On the 12th day, she came back from her visit to Hector Vega to find that Tobias had somehow acquired wood from somewhere and had stacked it neatly beside the stove, because she had mentioned the previous evening that her supply was getting low. On the 13th day, she found him in conversation with old Erasmo Torres, who came by every few days on account of the fluid in his lungs, and he was listening with that same full attention he gave everything, asking questions about Erasmo's cattle operation with what appeared to be genuine interest. And Erasmo, who was generally suspicious of strangers, was laughing. Ada observed all of this with the careful attention she gave to everything and tried very hard not to assign it meaning. On the 14th day, she addressed it directly. "Your shoulder is healing well," she told him during the morning dressing change. "The infection is gone. The muscle will be sore for some time, but you have full function. You do not need a nurse anymore, Tobias." He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel him choosing his words the way she had seen him do it before, carefully and without hurry. "I know that," he said. "Then I expect you have plans," she said. "Somewhere to go. You mentioned you were riding south." "I mentioned that, yes." "Well," he looked at her steadily, "I suppose the honest thing is to tell you that south was never a specific destination. It was just a direction. I do not have family waiting for me anywhere. I do not have a job that is expecting me. The things that were sending me south were more about what I was leaving than what I was going to." Ada put down the bandage she had been holding and gave him her full attention, which was a thing she did rarely enough that it'd weight when she did it. "What were you leaving?" He took a breath. "My brother Marcus died last year," he said. "Riding accident. It was fast, which I suppose is something. But he was my closest brother, and after he was gone the ranch did not feel like the same place anymore. My father and I have never particularly gotten on. I left in September. I have been moving since." There was a silence. Outside, a wagon went past on the main road, the driver calling something to someone on the other side. Callow Creek continuing its daily business, indifferent and unhurried. "I am sorry about your brother," Ada said, and she meant it the way she meant everything she said, completely and without ornament. "Thank you," he said. Another silence. Then, "Ada, I would like to stay in Callow Creek for a while. Not here in your clinic, I understand that would not be appropriate, but in the town. I am not without skills. I can work. I would like to be in a place for a while instead of passing through one." She looked at him for a long moment. The morning light was coming through the window and doing something complicated to his blue eyes that she was deliberately not thinking about. "That is your business," she said finally. "Callow Creek is not mine to dispense or withhold." "No," he agreed, "but your opinion of the idea matters to me." She looked down at the bandage in her hands, then back at him. "I think," she said carefully, "that a man with your practical skills could find work easily enough. The Double Cross Ranch north of town lost a hand to diphtheria last fall and has been short since. And the livery could use someone with good horse sense. I cannot speak to whether Callow Creek will suit you. It is a small place." "Small places can have considerable things in them," he said quietly. She was quite certain she knew what he meant, and equally certain she was not going to acknowledge it yet, because there were things that needed to be understood first. Things about her and her life and what she had built here, and none of that could be rushed. "Then I suppose you should get dressed and go introduce yourself to people," she said, and handed him the clean shirt she had mended while he was sleeping, because his own had been beyond saving, and she had found, in the trunk where she kept spare things for patients who arrived with nothing useful, a shirt of her father's that was close enough to the right size. He took the shirt and looked at it and then at her, and there was something in his face that she was going to have to address eventually, a softness and a directness together that she had not seen before in a face directed at her, but not today. Today she had Hector's carbuncle and Patsy's pregnancy, and a boy from the tannery who had burned his hand badly and been brought in an hour ago. Today was not for this. He went. He came back that afternoon to return the shirt, which she told him to keep, and to tell her that he had spoken to the foreman at the Double Cross and would start there the following Monday. He found a room at Mrs. Alcott's boarding house on the east side of town for $3 a month, which was what Mrs. Alcott charged everyone, and she did not negotiate. He bought himself a change of clothes at the dry goods store with money he had borrowed from the ranch hands who brought him in, a debt he intended to repay as soon as he had wages. Ada knew all of this because Callow Creek was the kind of town where everyone knew everything, and also because Tobias told her himself when he came by the clinic on Saturday to see whether she needed anything carried or lifted, because his shoulder was healed enough for light lifting, he said, and she looked like her supply shelves could use reorganizing. They were, in fact, a mess. She had been meaning to address them for 2 weeks and had not found the time. She let him reorganize them, telling herself it was practical and not sentimental, and she sat at her desk making notes in her patient log while he worked, and they talked the whole time, about nothing in particular and everything in general. And when he was done, and the shelves were in order, she felt the absence of his presence in the room like a drop in temperature. That was when she understood she was in some difficulty. Ada Collins had not been in difficulty of this particular kind before. She had been fond of people, certainly, and she had had what might have been called an understanding with a young schoolteacher in Taos before she came to Callow Creek, but that had faded naturally when distance made correspondence impractical, and she had not pined for it. She had been too busy to pine. She had been too busy for most things that were not medicine and the management of her clinic and the service of her patients. But she had also been lonely. This she knew and acknowledged to herself in private, in the quiet hours before sleep, because honesty was something she valued above almost everything, and it would have been dishonest to pretend that 3 years of being the only person in the territory who could do what she did had not exacted a certain toll. The respect was real. The gratitude was real. But gratitude was not companionship, and respect was not someone who sat across from you and listened with their whole attention and asked questions that required genuine thought to answer. She wrote in her patient log and listened to him reorganize her shelves and thought, "I am in difficulty." The next several weeks moved at the pace of a territory spring, which is to say quickly in some ways and with agonizing slowness in others. Tobias settled into Callow Creek with the ease of a man who had been settling into new places for years and had become good at it. He worked at the Double Cross 6 days a week and came into town on Saturday afternoons and Sunday mornings. He had a natural quality of directness that people responded to. Men liked him because he did not waste words and pulled his weight without complaint, and women liked him because he was polite in the old-fashioned way that meant he actually remembered what people told him and asked after it later. Within a month, he knew more people in Callow Creek by name than Ada had known after her first year, which she found both impressive and faintly amusing. He came by the clinic when she would allow it. She did not always allow it, because she had standards of her own to uphold, and she was aware that the town was watching, as small towns always watched. She was the nurse. She had a professional reputation that she had built with 3 years of very hard work, and she was not going to compromise it by being seen to entertain a male visitor at all hours. But she was also a human being and not a machine, and there were evenings, particularly the long ones in May when the sky went on for what seemed like forever after sunset in shades of orange and pink and deep violet, when the loneliness pressed in close enough that she was genuinely glad when she heard his step on the front porch. He always knocked. He never presumed. He brought small things sometimes. A jar of honey from a trading post he had passed on the road back from the ranch, a copy of a newspaper from Santa Fe that was a month old but still news to Callow Creek, once a wildflower he had found growing improbably out of a crack in the adobe wall of the post office, presented with a self-awareness about the gesture that made her laugh. "I recognize it is absurd," he had said. "It was the only thing I had to give you today, and I wanted to give you something." She had put the flower in a small glass jar with water, and it sat on her desk for 4 days before it finally gave up. In June, Patsy Dunmore's pregnancy took a dangerous turn. The baby was in a difficult position, and Patsy had been in labor for 18 hours when Ada realized that the situation required a decision she was not certain she had the right to make alone. There was a physician in Silver City, 130 miles away, and another in Albuquerque, 200 miles in the other direction. Neither was reachable in time for anything useful. Ada sent word to Reverend Marsh, and then she went to work with everything she had. Tobias arrived at the clinic at 11 o'clock at night, because someone at Mrs. Alcott's had told him there was a difficult birth happening, and he thought Ada might need something, though he had no specific idea what. He found Reverend Marsh on the porch looking tired and Ada's light burning fierce and yellow through the window. "Can I do anything?" he asked Marsh. "Pray if you are inclined," Marsh said. "She is the one doing the actual work." He stayed. Not intrusively, not in the way, but he was there when it was over, which was at 3 in the morning when Patsy Dunmore, exhausted and pale and fierce as fire, delivered a healthy boy who announced his arrival with a volume that suggested he was going to be a difficult person to overlook for the rest of his life. Ada came out to the porch to breathe the night air and found Tobias sitting on the step. She sat beside him without speaking for a long moment. The night was warm and full of cricket sound and the great wash of stars that the desert sky did better than anywhere else she had ever been. "Both of them?" he asked quietly. "Both of them," she said. "A boy, 8 pounds I think, though I do not have a reliable scale for infants, very loud." He let out a breath that sounded like relief, as though he had been holding it on her behalf. "Good," he said. "That is very good, Ada." She looked at her hands. They were steady. They were always steady when she was working. It was only afterward that the shaking sometimes came, the body's way of discharging what the mind had to keep controlled during the emergency. They were shaking now faintly, and she was annoyed by it. He noticed. She did not know how in the dark, but he did. He reached out slowly and without presumption and covered her hands with his. He did not say anything. He simply held them steady, and the warmth of his hands spread through hers and the shaking stopped. She should have moved her hands. She did not. "It is always like this afterward," she said, which was perhaps more than she had intended to say. "I know," he said. "I have seen it with men after a cattle drive that goes wrong. Your body catches up to what your mind was too busy to feel." "Yes," she said, "exactly like that." They sat in the dark with their hands tangled together and the stars overhead in Callow Creek asleep around them, and Ada was aware that something was happening that she would need to address, that she could not keep letting pass unspoken, but not tonight. Tonight she had brought two people safely through a very dangerous thing, and she was tired down to her bones, and his hands were warm and the stars were very beautiful. "Go home, Tobias," she said finally, not unkindly. "You have to be at the ranch by dawn." He stood and she stood, and for a moment they were very close in the dark. "Ada," he said, and his voice had changed somehow, had gone quieter and more serious, and she could feel the shape of what was coming the way she could feel a weather change in her joints. "Not tonight," she said quietly, not cruelly, not dismissively, just honestly. He nodded once, reading her the way she had come to understand he did, accurately and without offense. "Good night," he said, and walked down the step and away into the dark. She went inside and checked on Patsy and the baby, and then went to her room behind the clinic and sat on the edge of her bed for a long time before she slept. The conversation they were not having moved through June like an undercurrent, present under everything, altering the temperature of every exchange without being named. Ada was aware of it. She was certain Tobias was aware of it. They were both, for their own reasons, careful people, and carefulness sometimes expressed itself as delay. What moved things forward was, of all things, Nettie Alcott. Nettie was the proprietress of the boarding house, and one of the more forthright women Ada had ever encountered, which was saying something in a territory where forthright was practically a survival skill. She was 52, widowed twice, currently residing in a contented state of independence that she described as the best marriage she had ever had. She came to Ada for a persistent headache that had been bothering her since Easter and sat in the examination chair and said, while Ada was examining her eyes for signs of pressure, "That cowboy of yours is making Mrs. Ortega's daughter extremely nervous by being so obviously in love with someone else." Ada did not blink. "He is not my cowboy. He comes to your clinic every Saturday. He sent you a newspaper. He sat on your porch half the night during the Dunmore birth. He is a friendly acquaintance who is grateful for the medical care I provided." "Ada Collins," Nettie said, in the tone of a woman who had lived 52 years and was not going to sit quietly while a young person did something foolish. "I have seen grateful patients. They send a pie. They do not reorganize your shelves and bring you newspapers and sit on your porch in the dark." She paused. "He is a good man. I rent him a room. I know something about men." "I am aware of that," Ada said. "Open your eyes wider, please. I am saying this because someone should. You are allowed to want things for yourself, girl. You are the best nurse this territory has ever seen, and you work yourself half to death every week, and you have never in the 3 years I have known you taken a Sunday afternoon just for the pleasure of spending it somewhere nice." Ada stepped back. She made a note in Nettie's file. She said, "Your headaches are likely tension. I want you to take less coffee and more water and rest for an hour in the afternoon. Come back in 2 weeks." Nettie stood and put her hat on. "Think about what I said." Ada thought about it. On the last Sunday of June, she found Tobias on his way to the church service and asked him, with the directness she applied to everything, whether he would like to take a walk after dinner if he was not otherwise engaged. He looked at her for a moment, and his expression was very still in the particular way it got when something had moved him, but he was managing it carefully. "I would like that very much," he said. They walked out past the east edge of town toward the long flat mesa that rose up golden against the afternoon sky. It was hot, but not brutally so, the dry heat of the high desert that was more comfortable than the wet heat of lower country if you had lived in it long enough. Ada had worn her second-best dress, which was light blue cotton with small white buttons up the front, and she was aware that she had made this choice with some intention, which she also did not examine too closely. They walked and talked about nothing and everything as they always did, and it was easy in the way that things between them were always easy, as though they had been talking for years and were simply continuing. They sat on a flat rock at the edge of the mesa and looked out over the valley, where the town was a small arrangement of brown and white buildings, and the land beyond it spread out enormous and various and beautiful in the late afternoon light. "I want to tell you something," Tobias said, and his voice had that particular quality she had noticed before, the careful, deliberate quality of a man choosing honesty as his method. "All right," she said. He looked at the valley for a moment, then at her. "I have been trying to be patient because I did not want to overstep anything. You have been very clear that you have a life here that you have built yourself and that it runs on your terms, and I respect that completely. I do not want to be a complication you have to manage." "You are not a complication," she said. "I am glad to hear it." A pause. "But I want to say clearly what I think you already know, because I think you deserve to have it said clearly rather than implied. I came to Callow Creek because I was shot and needed medical care. I have stayed because of you. Not only because of you, I have found that I genuinely like this town and I believe I could be happy here. But the considerable part of what is keeping me here is that I have not, in 31 years of living, met anyone who thinks the way you think and works the way you work and sees things the way you see them. And I am not talking about your medical knowledge, though that is remarkable. I mean you, Ada, the specific and particular person you are." She was quiet for a long moment. The shadow of the mesa was beginning to reach across the valley. A hawk was describing circles high up in the hot blue air. "I am 31 years old," she said. "Yes. I am not going to leave my clinic. I am not going to stop being a nurse. I am not going to organize my life around someone else's plans or someone else's needs. This is my work and it is the thing I have given my life to, and I would not give it up." "I would never ask you to," he said, and he said it simply and without qualification, and she believed him. "I have been lonely," she said, which cost her something to say because she was not in the habit of admitting costs, "for a long time. I did not realize how much until you were here." "I have been lonely too," he said. "Since Marcus died, before that, if I am honest." She looked at him directly, the way she looked at things she needed to assess clearly. His face was open, the blue eyes steady and warm, and there was none of the performance that men sometimes put on when they were trying to achieve something. He was just there, present as he always was, and he was telling her the truth. "Then I think," she said carefully, "that we should find out what this is, properly, with honesty and sense." "That is exactly what I was hoping you would say," he said, and the thing that crossed his face then was a smile, a real one, not the dry humor he usually deployed, but something warmer and more unguarded, and it changed his whole face, and Ada felt something in her chest open like a window in spring. She did not reach for his hand, though she thought about it. It was enough for today to have said the thing and to have had it met, to have named what was true and found that the naming had not broken it. They walked back to town in the long, golden light of the late afternoon, talking again. And this time the undercurrent was gone and the surface was clear and warm, and everything felt, Ada thought, like a beginning. July in the New Mexico territory was not gentle with anyone, but the clinic was busier in summer than in any other season, because the heat created its own medical problems. Heat exhaustion, snakebite, the infections that flourished in warmth, the accidents that happened when men worked long days in brutal sun and their attention wandered. Ada was run off her feet, and Tobias understood this and did not compete with it. He continued to come on Saturdays when she could manage it, and occasionally on a weekday evening when she sent word that she was free for an hour, and they sat on the porch in the relative cool of the evening and talked, or he helped her with the clinic's endless maintenance tasks, or they simply sat in companionable quiet, which Ada found she valued as much as the conversation. What changed in July was physical proximity. Not in any way that would have raised eyebrows, nothing that was not appropriate, but the careful formal space between them began gradually to diminish. He sat closer on the porch step. She did not shift away. When she handed him things, their hands met and lingered. When he brought her the coffee he had started making on the clinic stove when he came by, the presenting of the cup involved a closeness that was not strictly necessary for the transfer of a vessel. On a Friday evening in the middle of July, when the town was drowsy with heat, and the sun had finally given up and gone behind the mountains. They were sitting on the porch, and she was telling him about a complicated case. The tanner's apprentice with the hand burn that had become infected and was not responding to her usual treatments, and she was worried about it. He was listening with full attention, asking the right questions, not the questions of a medical man, but the questions of someone who understood systems and problems and was trying to help her think through it. She said something about the limitations of what she had available, the frustration of knowing what was needed and not having the means, and he said, "I could ride to Silver City. The pharmacy there might have something you do not." She looked at him. "That is 4 days riding. I am aware. The ranch would not give you the time. I can ask, or I can leave and find other work when I come back. This is more important." She stared at him. "You would ride to Silver City and back 8 days on the road for one of my patients." "For you," he said quietly. "For one of your patients, yes, but also for you, because it is bothering you and I can do something about it." She was very still for a moment. Then she said, "That is one of the kindest things anyone has ever offered to do for me. Then people have not been offering enough." He went to Silver City the following Monday, having gotten 4 days from the ranch foreman, a gruff but fair man named Calloway, who had heard enough about Ada Collins to understand that this was a matter of some importance. Tobias was gone for 9 days in total, because the road was rough, and the pharmacy in Silver City required some negotiation about credit. But he came back with camphor-based preparations and additional silver nitrate, and a supply of carbolic acid solution that Ada had been trying to source for months. He also brought, because he had thought of it, a new set of bandage linen that he had found in a dry goods store in Silver City, neatly packaged, which would save her the labor of cutting and rolling for several weeks. When he came through the clinic door dusty and trail-worn and clearly tired, she looked at the things he had brought and then at him, and she said, "Tobias Brenner," and then she stopped, because the thing she felt was too large for the sentence she had started. He put the supplies on the table and stood there, reading her face. "You are all right?" he asked. "Everything all right here while I was gone? The tanner's boy is better. The infection broke on its own by Wednesday, but the camphor will help prevent recurrence." She paused. "I missed you," she said, and it was perfectly simple and perfectly true, and she let it stand there without qualification. He crossed the space between them in 2 steps and took her face in both his hands, carefully and deliberately, and said, "I missed you too, every single day." And then he kissed her, and she kissed him back, and it was very quiet in the clinic and very warm, and outside the street of Callow Creek went on about its business, utterly indifferent to the fact that the nurse and the cowboy were standing in the middle of her workroom with their faces together, and something complete and unmistakable happening between them. When they separated, she put her forehead against his collarbone and he put his arms around her, and she said, into the cotton of his shirt, "You smell like 9 days on the road." "I am aware of that too," he said, and she could feel the rumble of his voice against her forehead, and she laughed, and it occurred to her that she had not laughed like that, from somewhere genuine and unguarded, in a very long time. August arrived and brought with it the monsoon rains that swept up from Mexico every year, turning the desert roads to mud, and the dry washes to rushing rivers, and the air to something cooler and sweeter than June or July had been. Ada's clinic saw fewer emergency cases in the monsoon, and more of the chronic care she found most satisfying. The long conversations with elderly patients about managing their conditions, the careful monitoring of Patsy Dunmore's remarkable recovery, the general wellness of a community that trusted her. Her relationship with Tobias settled into a shape that felt, to both of them, entirely natural. He was in town on his days off, and she managed her schedule to reserve whatever time she could, and they spent it in ways that pleased her, walking out to the mesa, reading in companionable silence on the porch, cooking supper together in the small kitchen behind her clinic when she had time, which she found she enjoyed enormously. He was competent in the kitchen in the self-sufficient way of a man who had spent years providing for himself on the trail, and they developed a comfortable rhythm of working side by side that reminded her pleasantly of the way she had worked beside her father in this same space, which was not a comparison she made lightly. In September, her friend Ruth Halliday came through Callow Creek on her way to visit family in Santa Fe and stayed 3 days, and Ada was glad of her company and also acutely aware of Ruth's assessing gaze moving between herself and Tobias throughout the duration of his Saturday visit. When he left, Ruth said, "Well," in the tone of a woman who had said everything. "He is a good man," Ada said. "He looks at you like you are the most interesting thing in the world," Ruth said. "He looks at everything with that much attention," Ada said. "It is how he is." "He looks at you like that and also like he cannot believe his luck," Ruth said with more precision. "That is a different thing." Ada did not argue because Ruth was perceptive and she was not wrong. The conversation she had been avoiding having with herself happened in October, when the evenings turned cold and she began to stock the stove more heavily, and the clinic settled into the quiet rhythm of autumn. It was the kind of conversation that had no specific trigger, that simply arrived one evening when she was sitting at her desk making notes, and the lamp was burning warm and the stove was ticking, and she was thinking about Tobias in the uncomplicated way she had gotten used to thinking about him, with warmth and steadiness and something that had moved well past affection into a country she knew the name of but had not said yet, not even to herself. She said it now. She was in love with him. She had been in love with him for months, probably since the night on the porch after the Dunmore birth, possibly earlier. She was in love with him in the way that was durable and substantive, not the fever of early infatuation, but the steady warmth of genuine connection, the kind that was built from knowing a person in ordinary circumstances and difficult ones, and finding them to be someone you wanted beside you in both. She told him on a Saturday in late October. They were walking back from the mesa in the early afternoon, and the cottonwood trees along the creek had gone gold and the air smelled of wood smoke and dried grass, and she simply said it. "I love you, Tobias." He stopped walking. She stopped beside him and looked at him because she had said it and she was not going to unsay it. He turned to face her, and his expression was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on him. Something had come undone in his face, some last careful piece of control, and she saw everything underneath it all at once. The depth of what he felt, the months of it, the patience it had required. "Ada," he said, and his voice had gone rough. "I have loved you since the morning you handed me broth and told me I was considerably less likely to die than I had been 12 hours ago. I have been afraid some days that you would not want to hear it. I needed time," she said simply. "I am not a person who moves fast in these things." "I know," he said. "I would not have you be different." He took her hands in both of his, there on the road with the gold cottonwoods above them and the autumn light falling warm and level across the whole wide landscape, and he said, "I love you. I have loved you for a very long time. I am going to love you for considerably longer." She stepped into him and put her face against his shoulder, the healed shoulder, the one that had brought him to her door, and felt his arms come around her and hold her with a steadiness that matched everything else about him. "Good," she said, which was insufficient, but she was not always a woman for elaborate expression. She was a woman for precision, and the single word was precisely accurate. November brought cold and the usual complaints of cold, chest infections and chilblains, and the particular misery of people who worked outdoors in a high desert winter. Ada was busy, and Tobias continued to work at the Double Cross, and life in Callow Creek proceeded with its ordinary business. But there was something different in the texture of it now, something that had been absent before and was now present, a warmth at the center of the ordinary days that made even the difficult ones manageable. Reverend Marsh, who noticed everything, said one Sunday after the service, "You look well, Ada. The best I have seen you look in quite some time." "The cooler weather agrees with me," she said. He smiled, which meant he knew exactly what agreed with her and was politely not saying so. In December, Tobias's father came. This was not something anyone had anticipated, least of all Tobias. He arrived on the stage from El Paso, a large man in his late 50s named Caleb Brenner, with the same blue eyes as his son and considerably less of his son's patience. He came because someone, some wandering ranch hand passing through Texas, had mentioned that Tobias Brenner was settled in Callow Creek, New Mexico territory, and this had reached the senior Brenner through whatever channels such things traveled, and he had decided to come and see about it. Ada met him when Tobias brought him to the clinic on a Monday afternoon, because Tobias did not seem to know what else to do with him, and possibly also because he wanted to show his father what he had found. Caleb Brenner looked around the clinic with the evaluating gaze of a man who had managed large operations and was accustomed to assessing what he saw. He looked at Ada with the same gaze, and Ada met it with the same steady directness she applied to everything. "Miss Collins," he said. "Mr. Brenner," she said, "your son tells me you run cattle in Texas. That must be considerable work." "It is," he said. Something shifted in his expression, a slight recalibration at being addressed directly and without any of the deference some women of the era employed with men of his type. "I hear you are the only medical person in a large area. In 100 miles in any direction, yes. That is a lot of responsibility for one person." "It is," she said. "Would you like coffee? I was about to have some." The three of them sat in Ada's clinic with coffee, and the particular tension of a meeting between parents and the people their children have chosen, which has its own specific topography regardless of era or location. Caleb was not hostile. He was assessing. He asked Tobias questions about his work at the Double Cross, and Tobias answered them steadily. And he asked Ada questions about her training and her work, and she answered those with equal steadiness. And by the end of the second cup of coffee, Ada had the impression that whatever he had come to find out, he was finding it. He stayed 5 days at the boarding house. He and Tobias spent time together, walking and talking, working through whatever had accumulated between them in the year since Tobias had left, the grief of Marcus, and the estrangement that had followed. Ada heard about it secondhand, as Tobias processed it in the evenings on her porch. It was not a reconciliation exactly, because reconciliation implies a clear resolution, and these things rarely have one. But something had been said that needed saying, and something had been acknowledged that needed acknowledging, and Caleb Brenner left at the end of December with his son's address, and an expression that was, if not warm, at least no longer actively distant. On his last evening in Callow Creek, he came to the clinic alone and said to Ada, "My son has not been happy in a long time. He is happy here." He paused. "I do not think it is the town." "No," Ada agreed. "He could go back to Texas," Caleb said. "Work the ranch, there is always work." "He could," Ada said. "That would be his choice to make." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "You would not ask him to stay." "Callow Creek is not mine to offer," she said. "It is a town. He will go where he decides to go. I hope he decides to stay, but I will not put conditions on it." Caleb made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was something in that direction. "Stubborn," he said. "Yes," Ada agreed. He left the next morning, and Tobias stood in the street watching the stage until it was out of sight, and Ada stood beside him and took his hand, and he held it without speaking for a while. "How are you?" she asked. "I do not know yet," he said honestly. "Better, I think, different." "That sounds about right," she said. Christmas of 1883 was quiet and cold and genuinely pleasant. Reverend Marsh organized the usual community celebration, and Ada made a contribution of preserved fruit from her pantry, and Tobias helped carry chairs and tables from the church to the hall, and they stood together during the carol singing, which Tobias did badly and with no apparent concern about this. And Ada did not sing at all because she had not the voice for it, but she liked the sound of it around her. Nettie Alcott looked at them and smiled the smile of a woman who had said "I told you so" in her heart and was content to leave it there. New Year came in on a cold, clear night with a sky so full of stars it seemed impossible that it could hold them all. Ada and Tobias walked out to the edge of town and stood in the cold and watched the sky and said very little because the sky did not require commentary. "Ada," he said, as the year turned over, "I want to ask you something." She looked at him. His face in the starlight was very clear, and she could see the seriousness in it and also the hope. "I know that your work is everything to you," he said. "I know you are not going to leave, and I am not asking you to. I know that this life you have here is the life you chose and that it defines you in a way that is fundamental. I am not asking you to change any of it." He paused and took a breath, and she could see it cost him something too, even this man who was so steady, because some things cost everyone. "I am asking if you would like to share it with me, as my wife." She was quiet for a long moment. The cold air was very still, and the stars burned in silence, and from somewhere in town, a dog barked once and fell quiet. She had thought about this. She had turned it over in the careful way she turned over everything important, examining it from every angle, looking for the ways it might break or fail. She had found, to her genuine surprise, that she could not find them, not because she was not looking hard enough, but because there was nothing there. He had told her who he was and shown her consistently that it was true. He had never asked her to be smaller or quieter or less. He had never treated her work as a thing to be managed or accommodated. He treated it as a thing to be respected and supported. He had ridden to Silver City for 8 days in July heat because it bothered her that she could not help a patient. "Yes," she said. He looked at her very still. "Yes, yes," she said again. "I would like that very much." He kissed her then in the cold and the starlight at the turning of the year, and she put her arms around him and kissed him back, and somewhere in Callow Creek a coyote sang to the new year, and the stars continued in their indifferent perfection, and Ada Collins decided with her characteristic precision that this was exactly right. They were married in February of 1884, on a Saturday afternoon in the church, where Reverend Marsh had spent 3 years watching them in various stages of becoming. The whole town came, because in Callow Creek the whole town always came for things that mattered, and Ada Collins getting married was unquestionably a thing that mattered. Nettie Alcott cried. Erasmo Torres wore his best suit, which had last seen daylight at his daughter's wedding 6 years ago. Patsy Dunmore came with her 4-month-old son, who slept through the ceremony with the magnificent indifference of the very young, and Ada touched the baby's cheek afterward and thought about what Tobias had said, about sharing a life, and felt the fullness of it. Ada wore her mother's dress, which she had kept in a cedar trunk since coming to Callow Creek, not knowing when or whether she would use it. It was ivory silk, simple and well-made, and it fit her almost perfectly after a few adjustments that Nettie helped with the week before. Tobias wore a dark wool suit he had ordered from Santa Fe, because he wanted to do this properly, and he looked considerably more formal than she had ever seen him, and also, she thought privately, entirely splendid. When Reverend Marsh said, "You may kiss your bride," and Tobias kissed her, the assembled population of Callow Creek made sounds of approval, and Ada, who was not given to self-consciousness, felt a rush of something warm and unqualified move through her from head to foot. She moved into the clinic. He moved in with her. This was the obvious arrangement, because the clinic was the center of her work and her life, and she could not be anywhere else. And it turned out that the rooms behind the clinic, which Ada had always thought of as barely adequate for one person, were perfectly adequate for 2 people who were content with each other's company in small spaces. Tobias resigned from the Double Cross and took a position at the livery stable, which was closer, and offered more regular hours and a degree of flexibility that suited a man married to the territory's only nurse. He also began, in the informal way that practical people begin things, to assist with the clinic's maintenance and the heavier tasks that Ada had always managed herself but was glad to share. The cutting and stacking of wood, the hauling of water, the small repairs that an aging adobe building constantly required. Ada kept her name for professional purposes, and Tobias did not suggest otherwise. In the territory, Ada Collins was the name that people knew and trusted and came to when they were frightened and sick and needed help, and that name was not something to discard for the sake of convention. Spring arrived, and with it the particular renewal of energy that the desert spring always brought. The wildflowers that appeared improbably in every crack and hollow, the return of birdsong, the way the mesa went from dry brown to a dozen shades of green and gold. Ada's clinic continued its business. She delivered 4 more babies in the spring of 1884, all of them successful, and managed a complicated case of typhoid fever that came in on the stage from El Paso and required 3 weeks of exhausting care before the patient recovered, and dealt with the usual assortment of accidents and infections and chronic conditions that a frontier town generated constantly. Through all of it, Tobias was there. Not in the clinic, not intruding on her work, but present. He had coffee on when she came in from a night call. He noticed when she had been on her feet for 16 hours and told her to eat something, and then left her alone to do it on her own terms. He learned, with some attention, the rhythms of her practice. When she was in the focused space of active treatment and needed quiet, when she was in the reflective space after a difficult case and needed to talk, when she was in the ordinary space of routine care and was available for conversation. He also, in the small and consistent way he did everything, made himself useful to her patients. Erasmo Torres had come to like him considerably over the months and talked to him now as an equal about cattle and land and the business of the territory, which helped Erasmo, who did not naturally lean on other people, except the medical attention he needed. Old Hector Vega, whose neck carbuncle had finally fully resolved, and who now came in only for Ada's general monitoring of his aging constitution, had appointed himself something of a mentor to Tobias on the subject of Callow Creek's history and politics, which Tobias absorbed with his usual careful attention. Nettie Alcott, who had given up Tobias's room to a young telegrapher who had come to town when the new telegraph office was established, reported to Ada one morning in June that she had known from the beginning this was how it would go. "From the beginning," Ada said, repressing a smile with moderate success. "From the moment I watched him sweep your front step the 3rd week he was here," Nettie said serenely. "A man does not sweep a woman's front step unless his heart is already entirely compromised." In the autumn of 1884, Ada realized she was pregnant. She confirmed it first for herself, with the clinical certainty she applied to all diagnoses, and then she sat for a long time in the examining room after the last patient of the day had gone, with the lamp burning and the town outside the window going quiet for the evening, and thought about what this meant. She was not frightened, exactly. She was aware of the risks in a way that most women were not, because she had attended enough difficult births to know the full scope of what could happen, but she was also aware of the statistics, and she was healthy and strong, and there was no reason to expect difficulty. She was more surprised than frightened, and underneath the surprise was something that took her a moment to identify because it arrived with an intensity she had not quite expected: joy. She told him that evening after supper. He was washing the plates in the basin by the back window, and she was sitting at the kitchen table watching him, which she had come to enjoy as one of the small domestic pleasures of their shared life. And she said his name, and then, when he turned, "You are going to be a father." He stood very still. She watched the information move through him, saw it reach his understanding, and saw his face do something she would remember always. It did not perform happiness, it simply fell into it, like a man falling into warm water that was exactly the right temperature. He put down the plate. He came to her at the table and crouched down beside her chair and took both her hands in his and looked at her, and his eyes were very bright and his voice when he spoke was not entirely steady. "Are you all right?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I would know." "Yes," he said, "you would." He brought her hands to his mouth and pressed them there for a moment, not a kiss exactly, just held them against his lips. Then, "Ada, we are going to have a child." "Yes," she said. We are. I did not think, he said, and then stopped and then said more quietly, I did not know how to hope for this. She understood what he meant. After Marcus, after the year of wandering, after all the things that had required him to narrow his horizons to the next day and the next, he had not let himself hope for something this specific and this large. Well, she said, here it is. He pulled her carefully into his arms and held her with a gentleness that was different from his usual steadiness, more careful, as though she were something he was afraid of breaking, which amused her because she was not breakable and he knew it. But she let him hold her that way because she understood what it was about. The pregnancy progressed well through the winter. Ada continued to work almost to her full capacity, because she was the only medical care the territory had and she could not simply stop. But she managed herself sensibly, and Tobias was quietly attentive without being overbearing, which was exactly the right balance. When the weather was bad and the roads were poor, he accompanied her on house calls that required night travel, not to interfere but simply to manage the horse and the lantern and the carrying, so that she arrived at wherever she was going ready to work. He had learned enough from months of proximity to her practice to be genuinely useful in the way that a competent assistant is useful, not making medical decisions but anticipating needs and managing logistics. In January of 1885, Reverend Marsh's wife, Alina, who had been battling a persistent lung complaint for 2 years, took a severe turn. Ada spent 3 days essentially living at the Marsh house, sleeping in the spare room and managing Alina's care around the clock. Tobias brought food and clean linen and updated her on the clinic's waiting patients. Alina rallied on the 4th day, slowly and tentatively, and began the long work of recovery. When Ada came home after those 3 days, she was exhausted in a way that was deep and bone level, the exhaustion of sustained intense effort. Tobias had supper warm on the stove, and the lamp turned low and the bed turned down. He fed her and made her drink water and helped her to bed and sat beside her until she slept, and he did not tell her she should have rested or done things differently, because he knew she would not have done things differently and could not have, and he understood the difference between what she owed her patients and what she owed herself. You are a very good husband, she said, as she was falling asleep. You are very easy to be a good husband to, he said, which was perhaps generous but was also, she thought sleepily, probably what he actually believed. On a Wednesday morning in March of 1885, Ada gave birth to a son. She had Reverend Marsh's wife, Alina, who was recovered enough to help, and had trained under Ada's instruction over the past several months out of a combination of genuine interest and practical recognition that the territory needed more medical competence than one person could provide to assist with the birth. Tobias was in the front room of the clinic because Ada had told him to wait there, and he was not going to argue with her about medical management in her own clinic, but she could hear him through the wall, moving in the controlled way he had of managing anxiety, the way that looked like stillness from the outside but was something else within. The birth was not easy, but it was not dangerous. Ada was, above all things, a professional, and she managed her own labor with the same clear-headed practicality she brought to everyone else's, which made Alina slightly anxious and Ada entirely calm. The boy arrived at 7:30 in the morning with considerable noise and a quantity of dark hair and a grip, when Ada put her finger in his hand, that said this was not a person who would let things go easily. Bring Tobias, Ada said, when Alina had the baby cleaned and wrapped. He came through the door, and she watched his face when he saw the child, and it was something she thought she would remember as long as she lived. The way a man who has kept himself steady through many difficult things simply undoes, entirely and without apology, when faced with something so completely beyond the ordinary weight of the world. He came to the bed and sat on the edge, and she put the baby in his arms, and he held the boy with the terrified carefulness of a first-time father and looked at him for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at Ada. "He is all right?" he asked. "You are both all right?" "We are both very well," she said. He looked back at the baby. Then he said, "Samuel," without preamble, and Ada felt her throat close sharply. "After your father," he said, looking at her. She nodded, because for a moment she did not have words, and the fact that he had thought of it first, without prompting, was something she could not have prepared for. He reached out with one hand and she took it, and they sat together in the morning light with the baby between them, and outside the window of the clinic where Ada's father had practiced, and Ada had built her life, and a wandering cowboy had stopped being a patient, and started being everything else. Callow Creek was waking up to an ordinary Thursday. Samuel Collins Brenner grew with the vigor and determination of a child born to two stubborn people, which he had in abundance. He had Tobias's blue eyes and Ada's tendency to observe everything carefully before committing to action, and he had a laugh that came from somewhere large and unqualified that neither parent could quite account for but both loved unreservedly. Ada continued her work. She had negotiated, in the months before Samuel's birth, the beginning of a correspondence with a medical school in St. Louis about whether they might, through correspondence study and eventual examination, grant her a formal credential that matched what she already knew how to do. The process was slow and bureaucratic and thoroughly frustrating, as such things always were when women attempted to access institutions designed without them in mind. But Ada was patient and persistent in the way of people who are accustomed to working twice as hard for half the acknowledgement, and she kept at it. She also began, in the year following Samuel's birth, to train Alina Marsh in earnest. Alina proved to be a genuinely gifted student, quick and careful and unafraid of the difficult parts, and within a year she was competent to handle most of the routine cases that came to the clinic, which gave Ada the ability to manage her time more flexibly than she ever had before. She was still the most experienced practitioner in the territory. She was still the person the difficult cases came to. But she was no longer entirely alone in it, and that mattered more than she could have easily expressed. Tobias's work at the livery continued, and he had developed, in the way that competent and trustworthy people develop things, a reputation for being the man to go to if you had a difficult horse problem or needed reliable care for an animal of value. Several of the larger ranching operations in the territory had begun to hire him as a consultant of sorts for the management and selection of their stock, which paid considerably better than the daily livery work, and gave him the flexibility to be in Callow Creek when Ada needed him, and on the road when the work required it. By the summer of 1886, Callow Creek itself was changing. The telegraph had been joined by the prospect of a railroad spur, which was surveyed that summer and would, if the surveys led to actual construction, connect the town to the main line and the larger world beyond. This was, Ada thought, largely good. More connection meant more access to medicine and supplies and information, which she needed. It also meant that the town would grow and change, which was inevitable and not something she feared. She wrote to Tobias's father in Texas, a letter she composed with considerable care, describing Samuel's development and including a small portrait photograph she had made at the photographer's studio that had opened in Callow Creek in the spring. She wrote it because she thought Caleb Brenner deserved to know he had a grandson, and because she had decided in the 2 years since his visit that the man was difficult and proud and had made mistakes with his son, but was not at bottom beyond the reach of ordinary human connection. He wrote back within 3 weeks, which surprised her by its speed, a letter that was formal and somewhat stiff but genuine in its appreciation, and that asked carefully whether they might consider a visit. She showed it to Tobias, who read it twice and then said, "I suppose we should invite him." "I already wrote back and did," Ada said. He looked at her. "You are remarkable," he said. "I am practical," she said. "Samuel should know his grandfather. Your father should know his grandchild. Whatever is complicated between you and him is real, and I do not minimize it, but people are capable of change, and it would be a shame to foreclose the possibility before giving it a chance." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You never foreclose anything, do you?" "I am a nurse," she said. "Foreclosing possibilities costs lives." Caleb Brenner came in September of 1886, and it was not without its difficulties, because he and Tobias had real history to work through, and that did not happen cleanly or quickly. But he held Samuel on his knee and looked at the boy with something in his face that was unmistakably grandparental, a softening and a wonder that the proudest people cannot suppress when confronted with new life. And he watched Ada work, as much as she allowed it, with the expression of a man who was revising his understanding of something important. He stayed 2 weeks and left with an invitation to return at Christmas, which he accepted. When he had gone, Tobias sat at the kitchen table in the evening with a cup of coffee and said, "I did not expect to feel the things I felt this week." "What did you feel?" Ada asked. "Angry," he said, "about Marcus. Still, I do not think that goes away. But also something else, something about watching him with Samuel. The way he was with him was the way I wanted him to be with us when we were young." He paused. "I think he knows that. I think coming here was his way of saying so." "Sometimes people can only show what they could not say," Ada said. He looked at her. "Is that something your father said?" "It is something I have observed over 9 years of sitting with people in the most difficult moments of their lives," she said. "People very rarely manage to be who they most want to be in the ordinary moments. Sometimes the difficult ones are when you see clearly what was always there." He reached across the table and took her hand. "I love you," he said. "I love you too," she said. "Now drink your coffee before it goes cold." He laughed and drank his coffee, and Samuel made a sound from the bedroom that suggested he was awake and had opinions about it, and Ada went to see to him, and the evening went on in the warm and ordinary way of evenings in a life that was not grand or dramatic but was genuinely good. In the spring of 1887, the railroad came to Callow Creek. The first train arrived on a Tuesday morning in May, to the astonishment of almost everyone who had not quite believed it would actually happen until it did. A magnificent and terrible engine pulling several cars, hissing and clanking and smelling of coal smoke, entirely out of scale with everything around it, and absolutely real. Half the town came out to see it, including Ada with Samuel on her hip, and including Tobias, who stood beside them and watched the thing arrive with the particular expression of a man who is watching the world change and is not entirely sure whether to be glad or sorry and has decided to be both. The railroad brought more people to Callow Creek. It brought supplies. It brought a real physician, finally, a young doctor named Price who had graduated from a medical school in Philadelphia and came west for reasons that remained slightly unclear. He arrived in July of 1887, set up a practice in a proper office building that the town had constructed in anticipation, and came to introduce himself to Ada on his first day. She received him with perfect professional courtesy. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 26, with an earnest manner and an evident determination to prove himself, and she recognized in him something of herself at an earlier age, before the territory had finished shaping her. He looked around her clinic with the trained eye of a formally educated physician and said, with a respect that appeared entirely genuine, "You have managed remarkable things here, Miss Collins." "Mrs. Brenner in private life," she said. "Ada Collins in professional capacity. And what we have managed here is as much the community's work as mine. They taught me as much as I taught them." He nodded seriously. "I hope we can work together. I know I have a great deal to learn about this specific environment." "You do," she agreed, "and I can help with that. I also intend to continue my practice. I trust that will not be a problem." He blinked slightly at her directness. Then he said, "Of course not. The territory is large enough to keep 20 physicians busy. I would not presume to—" "Good," she said. "Then we understand each other. Come by Thursday evening and I will show you my patient records. There are things you will need to know about this community before you can serve it properly." He came Thursday evening, and she spent 3 hours walking him through 9 years of accumulated knowledge about the specific health challenges of this territory, its people, its particular dangers and patterns. He was a good student, she found, and she adjusted her expectations upward accordingly. Tobias, when she described this, said, "You are training your replacement." "No," she said, "I am training a colleague. There is a difference. I am not replaceable and neither is he. We are both needed and we will both serve different aspects of what this community requires." He knew better than to argue with her on medical matters. "You are going to train Alina and Price and probably half the town eventually," he said, with a warmth that was not quite teasing. "If half the town learns basic medicine, then fewer people will die of preventable things," she said reasonably. "That is the point of teaching." In December of 1887, Ada learned she was pregnant again. Samuel was 2 years old by this time and running, which was its own category of challenge, and Ada looked at the positive signs of her second pregnancy with a mixture of deep happiness and the exhausted irony of a woman who was already operating at maximum capacity. "Another one," she told Tobias that evening. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "When?" "August, I think." He came around the table and put his arms around her and held her, and she let herself be held in the warm and uncomplicated way she had finally learned to accept, after years of managing everything herself, as one of the genuine pleasures of a shared life. "Are you happy?" he asked. "Very," she said, terrified. "But very happy. Those are the same thing sometimes," he said. "That is unusually philosophical for you," she said. "You have been educating me for 4 years," he said. "Some of it was bound to take." She laughed into his shoulder, and Samuel, who was awake past his bedtime because he had inherited both parents' ability to resist sleep when there were interesting things happening, called from the other room in the imperious way of 2-year-olds who believe themselves to be the central fact of the universe. The second child arrived in August of 1888, in the middle of a monsoon evening when the rain was coming down hard enough to rattle the clinic's windows. Ada managed her own labor with somewhat more cooperation from Alina Marsh and somewhat less stoicism than the first time, because she had 2 years more experience now of telling herself the complete truth about things, including the truth that asking for help was not weakness. Dr. Price was present as a professional colleague, and he was competent and appropriately deferential, and got out of Ada's way when she told him to. A daughter. Small and fierce and entirely certain of herself from the first moment, with Ada's dark hair and some quality in her expression that was unidentifiable but entirely her own. "She is going to be trouble," Tobias said, holding her with the somewhat more practiced ease of a second-time father. "She is going to be magnificent," Ada said. "Those are the same thing," he said, which was perhaps his most genuinely insightful comment of the year. They named her Miriam after no one in particular, simply because it suited her. Callow Creek in the late 1880s was not the same town it had been when Ada arrived in 1880. The railroad had changed its character. It was larger, somewhat louder, more complex, and it had drawn people from elsewhere who had not grown up with the particular values and limitations of a frontier community. There were new saloons and a larger general store and a bank and a newspaper. There were also new problems, a population that moved more quickly through, that brought old conflicts with it, that tested the town's ability to manage its own growth. Ada navigated this the way she navigated everything, directly, honestly, and with a clear view of what mattered and what did not. Her clinic continued to serve whoever came through its door, regardless of background or origin or ability to pay, because that had always been its practice, and she saw no reason to change it. She had negotiated with Dr. Price a referral arrangement that sent complex surgical cases to him and complex long-term care cases to her, which played to each of their respective strengths and served the community far better than either of them alone could manage. The St. Louis Medical School correspondence had finally, in 1887, resulted in a formal credential. a certificate of recognized nursing practice that was not the physician's credential she had sometimes imagined, but was a genuine and official acknowledgement of her qualification, signed and stamped and entirely real. She had put it on the wall of the clinic next to her father's medical certificate, and the first time she looked at the two of them side by side, she had felt something complete and specific settle in her chest. Samuel started at the new school in Callow Creek in 1890, at 5 years old, and came home on the first day with the slightly stunned expression of a child who has discovered that the world contains many people his own age and has opinions about all of them. He was, his teacher would later tell Ada, extremely capable with numbers and extremely challenging to manage, which sounded accurate. Miriam was 2 and could already state her preferences with a clarity that was occasionally alarming. Tobias had, by 1890, expanded his work with the ranching operations to a point where he was managing the horse breeding and selection for 3 of the largest ranches in the territory. It was work that suited him precisely, combining his physical skill and his patience and his eye for quality in a way that made him genuinely useful at a level that mattered. He was also, by this point, a fixture in Callow Creek in the way that Ada had been for years, someone people came to not for formal professional reasons, but because they trusted his judgment and knew he would tell them the truth. In the evenings, in the kitchen behind the clinic that had become the heart of their shared life, they were still the same people they had been on that first porch in the dark, 2 people who listened to each other and told each other the truth, and did not require each other to be anything other than exactly what they were. "Do you ever think about Texas?" Ada asked him one evening in 1891, when Samuel was 6 and Miriam was 3, and they were sitting after supper in the quiet that small children occasionally leave when they have exhausted themselves and fallen asleep at last. He considered the question, as he always considered questions, thoroughly. "Sometimes," he said, "the country. The way the land looks in certain seasons. My brothers, when I think of them," he paused, "not in the way of wanting to go back, more in the way of remembering where you came from." "Does it bother you," she asked, "being so far from it?" He looked at her across the table. "Ada," he said, "I am where I want to be. I have been where I want to be since the morning after I arrived here and a woman in a clean apron handed me broth and told me I was considerably less likely to die than I had been. Nothing since then has suggested I should be anywhere else." She felt the warmth of it as she always did, even after years, because it had not worn with familiarity. "I am glad," she said. "I know," he said. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and they sat in the quiet house with the lamp burning warm and the sound of the children sleeping and Callow Creek outside the window going about its evening. And it was, as it had been for years, exactly right. Caleb Brenner died in the spring of 1892, peacefully, in his own bed in Texas, which was a good death by any standard. Tobias went to Texas for the burial, the first time he had been back in almost 9 years, taking Samuel with him because he thought the boy should know where his father came from. Ada stayed with Miriam and the clinic, and sent Tobias with a letter for his brothers that she had written carefully, expressing what she felt needed to be expressed on behalf of the family that she and Tobias had made together. He came back 2 weeks later, quieter than usual for a day or two, and then himself again, in the way of people who have completed something that needed completing. He had, he told her, stood at his father's grave and felt the uncomplicated grief that is possible only when the complicated things have already been worked through, and it had been, for all its sadness, something like peace. "Your brothers?" Ada asked. "Good men," he said. "I had forgotten how much I liked them." He paused. "They want us to come sometime, all of us." "We will," she said. They did go, that following summer, all 4 of them rattling south on the train in the heat of July, Samuel wide-eyed and voluble about every detail of the journey, Miriam asleep on Tobias's shoulder for most of the second day, Ada watching the landscape change as the high desert of New Mexico gave way to the flatter, browner expanse of Texas, and thinking about the journey her own life had taken and how it had led her to this. A husband she loved unreservedly, and children she was learning to know day by day, and a life so full of work and meaning. And yes, happiness, that it seemed almost improbable that it all belonged to her. The Texas Brenners were, as advertised, good men. Tobias's two surviving brothers and their families received Ada with the slightly wary respect that people extend to women of evident capability, and settled into genuine warmth within a day when it became clear that she had no agenda beyond being present and honest. Samuel, who had his father's quality of making himself at home easily, was absorbed into the cousins immediately, and returned each evening dirty and exhausted and entirely happy. "You are what he always needed," Tobias's older brother George said to Ada privately one evening, when the children were in bed and the men were out on the porch and Ada was helping George's wife Ida in the kitchen. "Tobias, you are what he needed." "He is also what I needed," Ada said. "It tends to work both ways." Ida, who had been listening with the quiet attention of a woman who has been observing people for a long time, said, "It does not always, though. Most times it is lopsided." "Most times," Ada agreed. "We were fortunate." They returned to Callow Creek at the end of August, sunburned and travel-worn and full of the particular satisfaction of a trip that has added something to your understanding of who you are and where you come from. Ada went back to her clinic with renewed energy and a clear sense of what she was working toward. Tobias went back to his horses and his work and his community with something settled in him that had not quite been settled before, some peace with his origins that allowed him to inhabit his present more completely. Eleanor Marsh had, by this point, qualified herself as a formally recognized nurse through the same correspondence program Ada had used, and the two women ran the clinic together with an efficiency that had reduced Ada's emergency burden considerably, though Ada remained the senior practitioner and the one the difficult cases required. Dr. Price had also become something closer to a genuine colleague than Ada had initially expected. He had shed much of his greenness in 4 years in the territory and developed the specific combination of medical knowledge and frontier pragmatism that the work demanded. Callow Creek in 1893 was unrecognizable in some ways from the town Ada had arrived in 13 years earlier. It had a proper school with 2 teachers, a bank, 3 churches, a newspaper that published twice weekly, and a population that had roughly tripled. The railroad had made it a junction point, which meant that trade and people moved through it in quantities that the original founders would have found incomprehensible. But it was still, at its core, a community in the way that only places that have faced hard things together become communities, and Ada was still the nurse, and her clinic was still the place people came when they were frightened and needed someone who knew what they were doing. On a Saturday evening in September of 1893, exactly 10 years after the freight wagon had brought a dusty and fever-bright cowboy through the territory and deposited him on her steps, Ada sat on the front porch of the clinic in the last of the autumn light. The porch had been rebuilt twice since then, and the clinic itself had been extended to accommodate the growth of its practice, and the sign above the door now read A. Collins and E. Marsh, Medical Care. But it was otherwise the same place, with the same view of the main road and the same smell of adobe and dry grass, and the faint medicinal undertone of a place where healing happened. Tobias came around the side of the building from the direction of the livery, which he had done 1,000 times, walking with the same easy, unhurried gait she had first seen the day she helped him off her examination table and out the door. He was 41 years old now, and the dark hair had silver in it at the temples, and there were lines in his face that had not been there in 1883, but the blue eyes were exactly the same, startling and direct. He sat beside her on the porch step. "Samuel got into trouble at school again," she said. "What did he do this time?" "He corrected the arithmetic teacher's calculation in front of the class. He was right, which made it considerably worse." Tobias made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "That is absolutely his mother's fault. He has your stubbornness," she said. "He has yours." From inside the clinic came the sound of Miriam's voice, sharp and particular, engaged in some argument with her own reflection in the washstand mirror, or possibly with an entirely imaginary person, which was another of her habits that was entirely her own. She was 5 years old, and in possession of opinions on every subject she had yet encountered, which covered considerable ground. The sun was going down behind the mesa, turning the sky the color she had loved since she was a child. The oranges and pinks that had always seemed to her like a specific and deliberate beauty, the sky doing what it did best in the last minutes of the day. 10 years, she said. Since you handed me broth and told me I was less likely to die, he said. Yes, she looked at him. Are you glad you stayed? He looked back at her, and his expression had the same quality it had had on that first morning in the clinic, when she had been cataloging him professionally and had noticed his eyes, direct, clear, and without pretense. Ada, he said, I am glad of every single thing that has happened since the morning I walked into this town. I am glad of every hard thing and every good thing and every ordinary day between them. I am glad of this porch and that mesa and your clinic and our children, and the fact that I get to sit beside you at the end of the day. I have not woken up once in 10 years wishing I had ridden south when you told me I was healed. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Neither have I wished you had left. He put his arm around her and she leaned against his shoulder, and they sat together on the porch of the clinic where her father had practiced, and she had built her life, and a wounded stranger had decided, against all efficiency and common sense, to stay. The mesa went gold in the last light. Callow Creek made its evening sounds around them. Miriam's voice inside rose and fell in its argument with the universe, and somewhere down the street Samuel was almost certainly doing something that would require a conversation tomorrow, and the world was exactly what it was, demanding and beautiful and insufficient and entirely enough. She was still the nurse of Callow Creek, New Mexico territory. She would be, for as long as she chose, and she intended to choose it for a very long time. And the cowboy she had healed was beside her on the step, and he was not going anywhere, and she was glad, with the deep and settled gladness of a woman who has been honest about what she wants and has found it to be completely real. Inside, Miriam's argument resolved itself in some invisible triumph that produced a crowing sound of pure satisfaction. Outside, the stars were beginning, one by one, to appear. Ada Collins looked at the darkening sky and felt the weight of everything she had. The work and the people and the man beside her and the children inside, and the life she had built from grief and determination, and the particular conviction that she had come to this place for a reason, and had not yet finished what she came to do. She had not. She would not for a long time, and that, more than anything, was exactly right.